The catalogue card sits in the National Archives Index under Lighthouse Board Technical Reports 1903. Inspector James Wycroft's signature runs across the bottom in brown ink. Next to it, the bound volume reference, TB 3847, filed the 19th of November, 1903. But when you pull the volume from the shelf, the pages where report 3847 should be are gone. Just a clean gap in the binding and a single stamp in red government ink. Extracted. The extraction date is noted in pencil on the facing page, 1924. No explanation, no authorization, signature. Just the word and the year. What Wycroft documented in that report was the Fresnel lens optical array at Cape Hatteras Light. He recorded refraction calculations and beam splitting capabilities that shouldn't have been possible with 1852 French lens grinding technology. He measured beam divergence angles that implied sub-arc second manufacturing precision. He described a secondary focal array built into the upper tiers of the prism assembly, function unclear. He noted phosphorescent coating on certain prism clusters that didn't appear in any Lighthouse supply records. And he mentioned something the keepers had been recording in their logbooks for decades: irregular beam periodicity during specific solar-lunar alignments. 6 weeks after Wycroft filed Report 3847, the U.S. Lighthouse Board issued Emergency Directive 12. It ordered the systematic replacement of all legacy optical mechanisms across 187 coastal installations. The work was to be completed within 14 months, and 4 months after that directive, Wycroft's name vanishes from Lighthouse Board employment records entirely. The official story about what happened in 1903 and 1904 is straightforward enough. It was a modernization program. The Lighthouse Board was replacing old oil lamps with electric arc lights, updating aging Fresnel lenses with standardized models, improving safety, reducing maintenance costs. They were phasing out obsolete technology from the 1850s and 1870s. It was presented as routine technological progress, bureaucratic efficiency, the kind of institutional housekeeping that doesn't require much explanation. But here is where that story starts to break. Emergency Directive 12 was called an emergency. There was no recorded emergency event. Previous lighthouse upgrades of similar scale had taken 6 to 12 years to complete. This one demanded 14 months. And the directive didn't just order replacement. It specified that all replaced mechanisms were to be decommissioned and rendered inoperable. That was not standard practice. Standard practice was to archive old lighthouse equipment for maritime museums. But in December 1903, the U.S. Lighthouse Board issued language that required destruction. And they weren't alone. Trinity House in Britain issued a parallel directive the same month. The French Commission des Phares followed in January 1904. 3 nations, same month, same language about legacy optical arrays, same urgency, same destruction protocol. This stops being about modernization. This starts being about systematic removal. What Wycroft had documented at Cape Hatteras was specific and technical. The Fresnel lens contained 1,024 individual prisms arranged in a 12-tier configuration. His measurements showed manufacturing precision that French lens grinding technology in 1852 could not have achieved. The secondary focal array he noted in the upper tiers didn't appear in Augustin Fresnel's published designs. The phosphorescent materials weren't in any supply records. And the keeper's observations about beam behavior during celestial alignments suggested these mechanisms were responding to conditions beyond simple light projection. His measurements suggested someone had built capabilities into these lenses that went beyond illumination. Either that, or someone had known something about optical engineering that the official record doesn't acknowledge. The question forming here is simple. What were these mechanisms actually doing? Wycroft inspected 31 lighthouses between 1902 and 1903. He filed supplementary notes on 19 of them. All 19 exhibited what he called non-standard optical configurations. All 19 appeared on the emergency replacement list. The other 168 lighthouses he inspected, the ones he didn't flag, remained in service with their original equipment for decades. The replacements didn't target old mechanisms. They targeted specific mechanisms, and those mechanisms formed a geographic pattern. The replaced lighthouses created 3 distinct coastal arcs. Those arcs aligned perfectly with major shipping lanes. They also aligned with naval approach routes. There was no public explanation for why those particular installations were selected, but the selection was not random. The lighthouse keepers knew something was unusual about these installations. Keeper families often served 2 or 3 generations at a single station. They kept detailed logbooks. Those logbooks contain references to atypical beam behavior during magnetic storms. Multiple keepers describe the prism arrays responding to atmospheric conditions. They mention secondary light patterns visible only in specific weather. They note navigators using the lighthouses for precision positioning that went beyond standard bearing identification. That knowledge was experiential. It was local. It was passed down through keeper families who lived at these stations and observed the mechanisms every night for decades. Emergency Directive 12 included mandatory reassignment protocols. The keepers at targeted lighthouses were transferred to inland posts or offered early retirement. Replacement keepers were brought in and trained only on the new electric systems. There was no transition overlap. The old keepers were gone before the new systems were installed. The institutional knowledge was erased deliberately. There was no written transfer of observational data. The official upgrade was sold as improvement. New electric arc lights with standardized reflector arrays, simplified maintenance, reduced keeper duties, modern efficiency. But the numbers tell a different story. The original Fresnel lenses had a visible range of 22 to 28 nautical miles. The new electric systems had a visible range of 18 to 24 nautical miles. That's a downgrade in capability, sold as an upgrade in technology. And the functional shift went beyond range. The old systems produced unique light signatures. Each lighthouse had variable timing and complex beam patterns. Navigators could identify individual stations by their distinctive characteristics. The new systems standardized everything. Flash intervals became uniform. Beam shapes became identical. Timing became centrally controlled. The old systems had individual distinctiveness. The new systems had centralized predictability. What was lost was capability and local variation. What was gained was control. The replacement was not about improving the light. It was about standardizing the light and centralizing control over who operated it. Now step back and look at what else was happening in 1903 and 1904. The same year the lighthouse replacements began, the United States, Britain, and France were coordinating the first international radio navigation experiments. The same year, the Naval War College published a new strategic doctrine called Coastal Approach Doctrine. The same year, major maritime insurance companies formed an international coordination bureau. These events aren't usually connected to lighthouse modernization, but the timing creates a pattern. Radio navigation required predictable coastal infrastructure. Naval doctrine required the ability to control coastal illumination during wartime. Maritime insurance required standardized risk assessment based on documented lighthouse behavior. All 3 institutional interests converged on the same technical requirement: predictable, centrally controlled coastal lighting systems. The emergency replacement program served all 3 interests simultaneously. It removed variable, keeper-dependent mechanisms and replaced them with standardized, electrically controlled systems that could be coordinated from central bureaus, shut down remotely if necessary, and documented in ways that satisfied insurance actuaries. What Wycroft saw in those mechanisms was important enough to document in a technical report, important enough that the report was filed in the official archive, important enough that someone extracted it from that archive 20 years later when the last generation of original lighthouse keepers was dying and no one could verify his technical descriptions anymore. The question is not just what the lenses were doing. The question is what made their removal so urgent that it required emergency authority, international coordination, destruction protocols, and the deliberate erasure of the people who understood them. The original Fresnel lenses weren't just navigational tools. They were precision optical instruments interacting with atmospheric and celestial phenomena in ways that keepers could observe and navigators could use. They provided capabilities that depended on local knowledge and experiential understanding. And in 1903, when institutional power needed coastal infrastructure to be predictable, controllable, and centrally managed, those capabilities became inconvenient. The catalogue card with Wycroft's signature still exists. The bound volume still sits on the archive shelf with that clean gap where report 3847 should be. The word extracted still marks the space in red ink. It's a record of something that was important enough to document and important enough to erase. And the fact that it was extracted in 1924, 20 years after the replacements, 20 years after Wycroft disappeared from the employment records, suggests that what he measured in those lenses remained dangerous even after the mechanisms themselves were gone. What Wycroft described in his report about the secondary focal array wasn't decorative complexity, it was functional design. The upper prism tiers contained optical elements that shouldn't have been there if the lens was only meant to broadcast light. The phosphorescent coating, he noted, was visible only under certain atmospheric conditions. The irregular periodicity during solar-lunar alignments meant the mechanisms were responding to celestial positioning. And the beam divergence precision he measured suggested manufacturing capability that exceeded what was officially possible in 1852. Put that together plainly. These lenses weren't just transmitting light outward, they were calibrated to interact with atmospheric and celestial conditions. The secondary arrays suggest they were designed to receive or measure, not just project. The precision suggests navigational triangulation that went far beyond simple bearing identification. These mechanisms could provide positioning data more accurate than anything officially acknowledged for that era. And that capability depended entirely on keepers who understood what they were observing and navigators who knew how to read the patterns. In 1903, 5 major maritime insurance companies formed the International Maritime Insurance Consortium: Lloyd's of London, Norddeutsche Lloyd, the American Marine Insurance Association, Compagnie Française d'Assurance Maritime, and the Imperial Maritime Trust. They created what they called standardized risk assessment protocols. They lobbied for predictable coastal navigation infrastructure. The economic logic was straightforward. Insurance rates were based on navigational risk. Risk was calculated using predictable, documented lighthouse patterns. The old Fresnel systems were unique, variable, and keeper-dependent. Every lighthouse had its own signature. Timing could shift based on atmospheric conditions and keeper judgment. That variability made actuarial calculations difficult. The new systems were standardized, centrally controlled, and insurance-friendly. Flash intervals were uniform. Beam patterns were identical. Behavior was predictable and could be documented in tables that insurance adjusters could reference when setting premiums. The consortium's recommendations matched Emergency Directive 12 specifications exactly. The directive was issued weeks after the consortium formed. There's no public record of industry lobbying, but private correspondence discovered in 1987 shows coordination between consortium representatives and Lighthouse Board officials throughout the autumn of 1903. The replacement program served financial standardization as directly as it served navigational safety, possibly more directly. The same year, the Naval War College shifted doctrine. Previous doctrine had treated lighthouses as civilian navigational aids. The new doctrine, published in January 1904, reclassified coastal illumination as defensive infrastructure. A classified appendix, declassified in 1972, was titled Standardization of Coastal Optical Systems for Wartime Conversion. The language is precise about what standardization enabled. Centralized control meant all lighthouse timing could be coordinated from a single federal bureau. Rapid shutdown capability meant electrical systems could be turned off remotely during wartime or national emergency. Elimination of keeper discretion meant no individual operator could vary the light signature based on local judgment. Military override provisions meant naval authority could commandeer the entire lighthouse network if necessary. Emergency Directive 12 was issued in December 1903. The first U.S. Navy Coastal Defense Integration Plan was published in January 1904. The British Admiralty's Lighthouse Coordination Protocol followed the same month. 3 militaries, same timing, same technical requirements. The replacement wasn't about light quality. It was about who controlled the light, and whether that control could be centralized and militarized when needed. The keepers who worked at lighthouses that weren't replaced kept their logbooks. Those logbooks survived because the stations weren't targeted. The entries show what the removed mechanisms were actually doing. Multiple keepers note compass deviation during specific light patterns. They describe mariners using lighthouse behavior to detect atmospheric electric conditions before storms. They mention prism arrays exhibiting responsive luminescence during auroral activity. They record light beams splitting into discrete vectors under specific humidity levels. What those observations suggest is that the original mechanisms were interacting with Earth's magnetic field. They were responding optically to atmospheric electrical phenomena. They were functioning, intentionally or not, as precision instruments for observing natural conditions that affected navigation. The keepers were watching these interactions every night. The knowledge was local, experiential, and outside institutional control. It couldn't be standardized because it depended on understanding specific conditions at specific locations. That decentralized knowledge represented a threat to institutional authority, not because it was dangerous, but because it couldn't be controlled, documented, or predicted from central bureaus. The keepers knew what the mechanisms could do. The navigators knew how to use that knowledge, and neither the keepers nor the navigators needed institutional permission to observe or apply what they understood. Lighthouse equipment was usually preserved when replaced. The Smithsonian Institution holds 47 Fresnel lenses from the 1870s through the 1920s. None of them are from the 1903 to 1905 replacement program. Trinity House Museum in London has an extensive lighthouse collection. The same gap exists. French maritime museums show the same absence. No intact lens from Emergency Directive 12 sites exists in any collection anywhere. The directive specified that replaced mechanisms were to be rendered inoperable, not decommissioned for display. Prisms were to be separated and dispersed. No complete mechanism was to remain intact. Disposal was to be witnessed and documented by federal inspectors. That's not standard museum archival language. That's destruction protocol language. Fragments surface occasionally in private collections or antique markets. Individual prisms, sections of brass framework, but never complete optical arrays. The archaeological absence is total. No researcher has ever located a full mechanism from the targeted sites. That suggests systematic destruction, not routine replacement, and it suggests the destruction was the point, not a bureaucratic afterthought. This wasn't modernization. This was evidence removal. Now look at who benefited from forgetting what those mechanisms could do. Maritime insurance companies gained standardization that reduced uncertainty and enabled precise premium calculations. Naval authorities gained centralized control over coastal navigation infrastructure that could be militarized during conflict. Industrial manufacturers gained contracts for mass-produced replacement systems. Federal bureaus gained consolidation of authority over previously independent lighthouse keepers who had operated with substantial autonomy for generations. What was lost was independent keeper knowledge, unique optical capabilities, decentralized observational data about atmospheric and magnetic phenomena, navigational precision that depended on understanding local conditions rather than consulting standardized tables. What was gained was predictability over capability, control over knowledge, standardization over specificity, and institutional authority over experiential expertise. They sold it as progress. What they were actually buying was compliance. The lighthouse replacement wasn't isolated. The same decade saw rural electrification programs standardize local power generation that had previously been managed by independent mill operators and municipal systems. Telegraph centralization replaced independent telegraph operators with employees of consolidated companies. Railroad gauge standardization eliminated local variations that had allowed regional lines to maintain operational independence. Timekeeping standardization through time zones replaced local solar time that had been set by town clockmakers and astronomical observation. Each modernization centralized what had previously been local. Each removed human discretion and experiential knowledge from the system. Each created infrastructure that could be controlled from centers of institutional power rather than managed by people who understood local conditions. And each was sold as progress while functioning as consolidation. The lighthouse replacement fits that pattern exactly. It wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a larger institutional redesign happening across multiple infrastructure systems simultaneously. The erasure of local knowledge was disguised as technological upgrade. The replacement of capability with controllability was framed as efficiency, and the people who lost their autonomy were told they were benefiting from modernization. Wycroft's missing report documented what the mechanisms could do. The report was extracted from the archives in 1924, 20 years after the replacement program, just as the last generation of original lighthouse keepers was dying. The timing ensured no one could compare his technical descriptions to modern analysis. No one could verify his measurements. No one could ask the keepers whether what he recorded matched what they had observed. What his measurements would reveal today is optical precision that predates acknowledged manufacturing capability. Functions built into the lenses that official design documents never mention. Evidence that someone in the mid-1800s knew more about atmospheric optics and celestial mechanical interactions than the official scientific record suggests. Either the mechanisms were far more sophisticated than we credit that era with producing, or the replacements were about removing evidence of that sophistication. Either way, the emergency removal suggests institutional fear of what the lenses proved. The catalogue card still sits in the National Archives Index. Wycroft's signature still runs across the bottom in brown ink. The bound volume still shows the gap where Report 3847 should be. The stamp still reads extracted in red government ink, but what it means now is different from what it appeared to mean at the beginning. It's not just a missing report, it's evidence of a coordinated institutional decision to erase technical capability, a choice to replace precision with standardization, a moment when what the lighthouses could reveal became more dangerous than what they could illuminate. They called it modernization, they framed it as safety, they sold it as progress. But what they actually did was remove 187 precision optical instruments that were interacting with natural phenomena in ways that independent keepers could observe, document, and understand without institutional permission or central oversight. And they did it in 14 months, across 3 nations, with emergency authority that bypassed normal bureaucratic review, and they destroyed every single one. The lighthouses still stand on their rocky promontories and barrier islands. The light still rotates through the darkness every night. Ships still use them for navigation. But what the light measures now is only what we're allowed to see. The mechanisms that could measure more, that responded to conditions the keepers learned to read, that provided capabilities navigators understood how to use those, are gone. And the last person who filed a technical report documenting what those mechanisms actually did disappeared from the employment records 4 months after he put his name on the page.